In this episode, we're going to take a careful look at a problem that shows up again and again in real organizations. They have supply chain controls on paper, but they do not know whether those controls actually work. Beginners often assume that if a vendor signs an agreement, provides a policy document, or answers questions during onboarding, then the risk is handled. Those steps can be useful, but they are not the same as verifying and validating controls in a way that confirms outcomes. Verification is about checking that a control exists and is being followed, while validation is about checking that the control produces the protective result you need. In supply chain contexts, you have an added challenge because the controls are often operated by someone else, and your organization may have limited visibility into their environment. That makes it even more important to focus on evidence and outcomes instead of assumptions. By the end, you should understand what it means to verify and validate supply chain controls, why paper proof is not enough, and how to think about confirmation without becoming overly technical or unrealistic. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To make the topic concrete, let's define what we mean by supply chain controls. These are the rules, practices, and safeguards that reduce risks created by vendors, suppliers, and partners. They can include contractual commitments, access restrictions, processes for handling sensitive data, incident notification expectations, change management expectations, and continuity expectations. Some controls are primarily organizational, like who is allowed to access your data and how that access is approved. Some are technical in effect, like how data is separated between customers or how updates are protected from tampering, even if you never see the internal details. The purpose of all of them is to reduce likelihood of harm, reduce impact if harm occurs, or both. A beginner-friendly way to describe it is that supply chain controls are the guardrails that keep a dependency from turning into a disaster. Verification starts with evidence, and evidence is what separates belief from knowledge. When you verify a control, you are looking for proof that it is implemented and that it is operating as described. If a vendor claims they restrict access to your data, verification might involve evidence of access governance, such as role definitions and approval processes, without exposing sensitive internal details. If a vendor claims they have incident response procedures, verification might involve seeing that procedures exist, that roles are defined, and that notification steps are documented. If a vendor claims they have continuity planning, verification might involve evidence that plans exist and that they are reviewed periodically. The point is not to collect as many documents as possible. It is to collect the right evidence that supports the control's existence and operation. Beginners should learn that verification is not about trust versus distrust. It is about making sure critical assumptions have support. Validation goes a step further because it asks whether the control actually achieves the outcome you need. A vendor can have a documented incident process and still notify customers too late to be useful, which means the control exists but the outcome is not adequate. A vendor can have a backup plan and still fail to restore service within an acceptable time, which means the control exists but the impact reduction is not real. A vendor can have access controls and still experience repeated unauthorized access incidents, which suggests the controls are not effective enough for the risk profile. Validation often relies on observed performance, such as how the vendor behaves during real incidents, how quickly they respond to issues, and whether they communicate clearly and consistently. For beginners, the key idea is that validation focuses on results, not on promises. A common reason organizations skip validation is that they believe it is impossible without deep technical access, but that is not fully true. You can validate many supply chain controls by focusing on operational signals and by designing the relationship so performance is visible. For example, you can evaluate whether uptime and recovery expectations are being met by observing service availability and the vendor's response to disruptions. You can evaluate whether change management is responsible by observing whether major changes cause repeated issues and whether the vendor provides timely notice and clear explanations. You can evaluate whether incident notification is effective by tracking notification timeliness and completeness when events occur. This kind of validation does not require you to inspect internal systems. It requires you to pay attention to patterns and outcomes. Beginners should see that evidence can be operational, not just documentary. Another important concept is the difference between one-time checks and ongoing confirmation. Many organizations do a vendor assessment during onboarding and then never revisit it, but vendors change over time and risk changes with them. A vendor might grow quickly and struggle operationally, or they might outsource more work to subcontractors, changing your exposure. They might introduce new features that handle your data differently, or they might move services to different locations. Verification and validation must therefore be periodic and event-driven, meaning you revisit them on a schedule and also when significant changes occur. This is not about making vendor management burdensome. It is about preventing a slow drift into higher risk without noticing. Beginners should understand that risk management is a living process, and supply chain controls require the same ongoing attention as internal controls. Supply chain control confirmation also depends on clarity about what control objectives are most important, because you cannot verify everything equally. If the vendor handles sensitive data, confidentiality and access controls may be your top priority. If the vendor provides a critical service, availability and recovery performance may dominate your concerns. If the vendor supplies software components, integrity of updates and the ability to detect tampering may be central. Prioritization keeps verification and validation focused and realistic, and it prevents the common failure of collecting a huge stack of low-value documentation. A beginner-friendly approach is to start with the most severe outcomes you are trying to prevent and then confirm the controls that most directly influence those outcomes. When you do that, your confirmation effort is proportional to the risk and easier to sustain. It's also important to address the role of subcontractors and fourth parties, because supply chains rarely stop at the vendor you sign with. A vendor may rely on other providers for hosting, support, monitoring, or development, and those dependencies can affect you even if you never interact with them directly. Verification includes understanding whether subcontractors exist and what the vendor's oversight expectations are for them. Validation includes watching whether subcontractor-related problems show up as outages, delays, or unexplained incidents. Beginners should grasp that a supply chain is layered, and risk can be introduced at any layer, which is why transparency and oversight are important control objectives. If a vendor cannot clearly explain their critical dependencies, that lack of clarity is itself a risk signal that should influence how you treat the relationship. Another core idea is that compensating controls apply in supply chain contexts too. Sometimes a vendor cannot meet a preferred requirement due to the way their service is designed, but you may still be able to manage the risk with alternate safeguards. For example, if a vendor cannot support a certain access model, you might reduce risk by limiting what data they receive, limiting how long they retain it, or adding additional monitoring on your side. If a vendor cannot guarantee certain recovery times, you might reduce impact by building a secondary option or a manual fallback process. The important part is that compensating controls should be verified and validated as well, because they are often fragile and depend on consistent behavior. Beginners should recognize that a compensating control is not a compromise of safety. It is a different path to the same protective outcome, and it must be confirmed with evidence. A practical way to think about confirming controls is to ask 3 questions that connect directly to evidence and outcomes. First, what do we need this control to prevent or limit, stated as an outcome that matters to us? Second, what evidence would convince us that the control is operating without requiring unrealistic visibility? Third, what real-world performance would show that the control is effective, such as timeliness, consistency, and resilience during stress? These questions help avoid 2 extremes: blind trust based on documents and impossible demands for total transparency. They also help you design reporting that is decision-ready, because you can show which controls are confirmed and which controls remain uncertain. For beginners, the big learning is that confirmation is a structured reasoning process, not just paperwork collection. Finally, confirmation must feed back into risk management decisions, because verification and validation are only valuable if they change what you do. If evidence suggests a control is weak or failing, you might require improvement, reduce the scope of the relationship, increase monitoring, or plan an exit strategy. If validation shows strong performance over time, you might reduce the intensity of review and focus effort elsewhere, while still maintaining baseline oversight. Reporting control effectiveness helps leaders see where supply chain risk is well managed and where it is not, which supports prioritization and budgeting. It also prevents surprise because you are tracking control health like you would track the health of internal controls. Beginners should understand that the point of confirming controls is to keep risk within tolerance, not to complete an assessment ritual. To conclude, verifying and validating supply chain controls is how an organization confirms that its third-party guardrails are real and effective, not just well-written. Verification looks for evidence that controls exist and are operating, while validation looks for proof through outcomes and performance that the controls actually reduce risk. Because vendors and dependencies change over time, confirmation must be ongoing and focused on the controls that matter most to your most severe outcomes. You can validate many controls through operational signals and observed behavior, even without deep technical access, and you should treat lack of transparency as a risk indicator. When confirmation findings feed back into treatment decisions, monitoring intensity, and relationship management, supply chain risk becomes manageable and defensible. The essential beginner takeaway is that control language is not protection by itself. Protection comes from controls that can be confirmed, trusted through evidence, and proven through outcomes.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.